25 heavily armed insurgents crest the ridge. Below them, a pinned SEAL team is out of ammo, out of time, and seconds from slaughter. Their only hope is a single female sniper, bleeding and staring through a shattered scope. If she misses a single shot, they all die. Captain David Caldwell pressed his back against the crumbling adobe wall, feeling the heat of the baked mud through his uniform. Dust coated everything: his rifle, his face, the back of his throat. It tasted like old pennies and chalk. A heavy round from a DSHK machine gun slammed into the other side of the wall. The impact sent a violent tremor through Caldwell's spine, knocking a shower of pulverized clay over his shoulders. "Jackson," Caldwell barked, his voice hoarse. There was no answer. 10 feet away, in a shallow depression that used to be an irrigation trough, Jackson lay flat on his back. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the dust beneath his thigh, turning the pale sand into a thick crimson mud. Miller was kneeling over him, hands pressing down hard on the femoral artery, his face pale beneath streaks of camouflage paint and soot. "He's under, Cap," Miller shouted over the deafening crack of incoming rifle fire. "Tourniquet is as tight as I can crank it, but he lost too much before I got to him. I'm out of gauze. I'm out of everything." Caldwell looked down at his own rifle. He thumbed the magazine release and caught the metal box in his palm. It felt terrifyingly light. He pushed the top round down with his thumb. 3 bullets left. He slapped the magazine back into the receiver and looked at Miller. "Ammo?" Caldwell asked. Miller didn't even bother checking his rig. "Dry. I tossed my last mag into the saw before it jammed. I've got a sidearm with 6 rounds. Caldwell swallowed the grit in his mouth. They were trapped in the courtyard of a ruined goat herder's compound at the bottom of a steep, unnamed wadi. It was a textbook ambush. The enemy had let them walk right into the basin before opening up from the high ground. For the last 40 minutes, it had been a systematic dismantling of Caldwell's team. They had fought violently, pushing back 2 frontal assaults, but the sheer volume of enemy fire had chewed their cover down to knee-high rubble. Now the silence between the gunshots was growing longer. Caldwell knew what that meant. The enemy was shifting. They had stopped trying to shoot through the mud walls and were maneuvering to completely surround the lip of the basin. Caldwell keyed the radio strapped to his chest. "Overwatch, this is Alpha 1. What's the traffic look like up there?" Static hissed in his earpiece, followed by the slow, measured breathing of Olivia Hayes. "Alpha 1, Overwatch," Hayes's voice came back. It was infuriatingly calm, stripped of any inflection. "You've got a problem on your 6. They stopped pushing the front. They're funneling into the eastern trench." Caldwell squeezed his eyes shut. The eastern trench was a dried-up aqueduct that ran straight down the mountain and emptied out barely 30 yards behind Caldwell's current position. If the enemy used that trench, they could walk right up to the back of the compound completely unseen, step over the rubble, and shoot Caldwell and his men from above. "How many?" Caldwell asked. "I'm counting." A pause. Caldwell could hear the faint, metallic scrape of Hayes adjusting her rifle on the rocks high above. "2 technicals just dropped off a fresh platoon. They're clustering at the top of the trench. I count 25 dismounts. They are getting ready to push down the pipe." Caldwell felt a cold knot form in his stomach, completely at odds with the 100-degree desert heat. 25 fresh fighters, against 2 men with empty rifles and 1 bleeding out in the dirt. He looked at Miller. Miller stared back, his hands still slick with Jackson's blood. Miller was 23 years old. He had a wife in San Diego who was 6 months pregnant. Caldwell had written the recommendation letter that got Miller onto this deployment. The crushing weight of leadership pressed down on Caldwell's chest, making it hard to draw breath. He had led these men into the valley. He had failed to see the trap. Caldwell keyed his mic again. "Hayes, listen to me. We are black on ammo. Jackson is critical. We cannot hold a rear assault." Up on the ridgeline, 350 yards away, Hayes didn't immediately respond. Caldwell listened to the static. He imagined her up there, isolated, looking down at the inevitable end of her team. "Hayes," Caldwell said, his voice dropping the professional military cadence. It was just a man, terrified for his boys, pleading with the only person left who could do anything about it. "If they clear that trench, we're dead, all of us." "Copy," Hayes said. The radio clicked off. Caldwell lowered his head against the mud wall and racked the bolt of his rifle to ensure a round was chambered. 3 shots. He would make them count. But he knew, with the absolute certainty of a man who had spent 15 years at war, that it wouldn't be enough. 350 yards away, Olivia Hayes lay motionless on a slab of sun-baked shale. The rock beneath her was hot enough to blister bare skin, but she didn't notice. Her entire world had shrunk to the optical circle of her scope. A deep laceration cut across her left cheekbone, the result of a secondary rock fragmentation from an RPG that had hit her position 20 minutes prior. Blood had dried in a crusty line down her jaw, itching furiously beneath her sweat-soaked collar. She ignored it. She looked through the glass of her optic. The magnification pulled the eastern trench right up to her eye. It was a deep, V-shaped gouge in the earth, flanked by high rocks on either side. It was a perfect avenue of approach for the enemy. They would be completely protected from Caldwell's position at the bottom of the valley. But from Hayes's elevated flank, she looked straight down the throat of the trench. It was a fatal funnel. Through the reticle, she watched the fighters massing at the top of the draw. They were agitated, high on adrenaline, shouting and racking the bolts of their AK-47s. They knew the Americans below were pinned and out of the fight. This wasn't a tactical maneuver anymore. It was a mob preparing for an execution. Hayes did the math. Her brain processed the variables with mechanical efficiency. Distance, 350 yards. Wind, 3 miles per hour, coming from the west, negligible at this range. Weapon, M11, semi-automatic sniper system, suppressed, 7.62 mm match-grade ammunition. Magazine capacity, 20 rounds. She looked at the mass of men, 25 targets. If she started shooting while they were at the top of the trench, they would simply scatter back into the rocks. She might kill 3 or 4, but the rest would go to ground, wait her out, and eventually find another way down to kill Caldwell. No, she had to let them commit. She had to let them enter the steep, narrow walls of the trench where they couldn't climb out. She had to let them run halfway down before she opened fire. But there was a catch. The trench was steep. Once they started running, gravity and momentum would carry them fast. From the halfway point of the trench to the exit directly behind Caldwell's back, it was only a 50-yard sprint. 25 men running full tilt. It would take them exactly 10 seconds to cover that distance and spill out into the compound. If they made it out of the trench, Caldwell died, which meant Hayes had 10 seconds to kill 25 men. She looked at the rifle in her hands. She had 20 rounds in the magazine. To kill 25 targets, she would have to shoot the gun dry, drop the empty magazine, retrieve a fresh one from her chest rig, seat it in the mag well, hit the bolt release, and acquire the remaining 5 targets, all in 10 seconds, all while tracking moving bodies. It was a physical impossibility. The recoil management alone, pulling the trigger that fast without losing the sight picture, was something out of a video game. But the cold, hard reality of the desert didn't care about what was possible. Caldwell's voice crackled in her ear again, tight and raw. If they clear that trench, we're dead. Hayes reached down to the chest rig strapped over her armor. She pulled a fresh, heavy 20-round magazine from its nylon pouch. She placed it carefully on the flat rock immediately next to the rifle's receiver, exactly where her hand would naturally fall. She wiped her right hand on her pants to get rid of the sweat, then gripped the pistol grip of the rifle. Her finger rested straight along the receiver, just above the trigger. "Alpha 1, this is Overwatch," Hayes said, keeping her eye glued to the scope. "Keep your heads in the dirt. Do not look up. Do not move." Through the optic, the enemy leader raised an arm and swung it forward. The mob surged. They poured into the trench. Dust kicked up in thick, choking clouds as sandals and combat boots pounded the dry earth. They were moving incredibly fast, practically falling down the steep decline, their weapons held high. They were shoulder to shoulder, a dense wall of human bodies funneling into the narrow rock corridor. Hayes controlled her breathing. Inhale, exhale. She watched them pass the first rock marker, then the second. They were halfway down. The exit of the trench and Caldwell's exposed back was just 50 yards away. 10 seconds. Hayes slid her index finger inside the trigger guard. The curved metal was hot. She settled the crosshairs of her reticle center mass on the lead runner. She didn't think about Caldwell. She didn't think about Miller's pregnant wife. She didn't think about the math anymore. The human part of her brain shut down, ceding control to thousands of hours of muscle memory, to the brutal, unyielding repetition of the firing range. She exhaled her final breath, letting the air bleed out of her lungs until she reached the natural respiratory pause. Her chest stopped moving. The crosshairs floated perfectly still on the chest of the lead fighter. Hayes pulled the trigger. The heavy 7.62mm round left the barrel of the M110 at 2,500 feet per second. The suppressed rifle didn't boom. It produced a sharp, concussive crack, like a massive whip snapping in the dry desert air. Through the scope, Hayes watched the lead fighter's chest cavity cave inward. The kinetic energy of the heavy match-grade bullet lifted him off his feet and threw him violently backward into the man running directly behind him. They both went down in a tangle of limbs and dropped rifles. The recoil punched Hayes's shoulder, driving the buttstock into the pocket of her armor. The crosshairs jumped off the target, kicking up and to the right. 1. Hayes didn't fight the recoil. She rode it, using the downward settling motion of the rifle's heavy barrel to snap the reticle onto the next chest. Her finger trapped the trigger against the rear of the guard, feeling for the distinct metallic click of the sear resetting. 2. She pulled. Another concussive snap. The heavy bolt carrier group cycled inside the receiver, ejecting a smoking brass casing that pinged against the shale beside her head. Down in the trench, a man wearing a dark chest rig collapsed sideways, slamming into the rock wall. 3, 4, 5. She fired in a relentless, mechanical cadence. It wasn't the slow, methodical marksmanship of a sniper in a hide. It was a desperate, controlled burn of ammunition. She pinned her cheek to the stock, locking her upper body into a rigid platform. Her world consisted only of the red chevron of her optic, the heavy trigger pull, and the recoil impulse. The trench was turning into a meat grinder. The steep decline and the narrow walls worked exactly as Hayes had calculated. The men in the back were running too fast to stop. Blinded by the choking dust, kicked up by the boots in front of them, they collided violently with the bodies of the men Hayes was dropping. 8, 9, 10. The brass casings were flying out of the ejection port in a steady, arcing stream. The smell of burnt cordite and hot gun oil filled Hayes's nostrils, harsh and metallic. Through the glass, the dust was thickening into a brown fog. She fired at the silhouettes pushing through the haze. A fighter tried to scramble up the left side of the trench to escape the bottleneck. Hayes put the crosshairs on his hip and fired. He slid backward into the crush of bodies. 14, 15. The barrel of the M110 was heating up rapidly. The suppressor, trapping the expanding gases of the fired rounds, was glowing a dull, angry cherry red beneath its thermal cover. A heat mirage began to radiate upward from the steel, creating a rippling, watery distortion at the bottom of her scope. 16, 17. She shifted her aim lower, shooting through the heavy canvas webbing and ammunition pouches of the men trying to crawl over their dead comrades. The noise of the rifle cycling right next to her ear was a deafening, rhythmic clatter. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull ache from the repeated battering. 19, 20. Hayes pulled the trigger. The rifle fired. Then, instead of the heavy forward slam of a new round chambering, Hayes felt a hollow, metallic vibration. The bolt locked back, empty. Down in the trench, 5 men remained. They had finally realized the slaughter wasn't coming from the bottom of the hill, but from above. They were 30 yards from Caldwell's back. Hayes's right index finger came off the trigger. Her right hand completely left the pistol grip. This violated every sniper fundamental she had ever been taught, but she didn't have the luxury of fundamentals. She needed speed. Her left thumb jammed the magazine release button above the trigger guard. The empty steel box dropped free, clattering onto the rocks. Simultaneously, her right hand swept down, grabbing the fresh 20-round magazine she had staged on the flat stone beside her. She slammed the heavy magazine up into the mag well. It seated with a solid click. Her left hand slapped the bolt catch paddle on the side of the receiver. The heavy steel bolt slammed forward, stripping the top round from the magazine and driving it into the smoking chamber. Her right hand snapped back to the pistol grip. Less than 2 seconds. She forced her eye back into the optic. The heat mirage from the suppressor was worse now, blurring the edges of her reticle. The final 5 men had broken through the pile of bodies. They were sprinting the last 20 yards. They were terrified, running with the desperate speed of men who knew they were trapped in a kill zone. 21. Hayes dropped the first runner. He pitched forward, sliding on his chest down the steep dirt. 22. 23. 2 rapid shots. She didn't wait to see them fall. She transitioned the rifle horizontally, dragging the crosshairs across the dust cloud. The 4th man stopped, raised his AK-47 blindly toward the ridge, and pulled the trigger. Rounds snapped harmlessly through the air 50 feet above Hayes's head. She settled the chevron on his throat and fired. 24. He dropped. Hayes shifted to the final target. He was moving the fastest. He was wearing a faded green field jacket, and he wasn't looking up. He was looking straight down at the compound. He was 10 yards from the exit. 5 yards. He breached the lip of the trench. He looked down and saw Caldwell kneeling in the rubble, completely exposed. The fighter raised his rifle. Hayes didn't have time to control her breathing. She didn't have time to let the crosshairs settle. She saw the green jacket enter the edge of her optic, jerked the barrel an inch to the right, and crushed the trigger. 25. The 7.62mm round caught the fighter in the side of the head, just as his finger tightened on his own trigger. His AK-47 fired a single, wild shot into the mud wall above Caldwell's head before the man's body went limp. His forward momentum carried him over the edge of the trench. He fell heavily down the steep dirt embankment, landing in a crumpled heap of green fabric and shattered bone less than 4 feet behind Caldwell's boots. A cloud of fine, powdery dust billowed over the compound, drifting slowly over Caldwell and Miller. Then the valley fell completely silent. Captain David Caldwell flinched as the body hit the dirt. The dead fighter landed with a heavy, wet thud that vibrated through the soles of Caldwell's boots. A shower of loose earth and pulverized clay rained down on Caldwell's neck, sliding under the collar of his uniform and sticking to the sweat on his skin. He didn't turn around immediately. He stared blindly at the cratered dirt wall in front of him. His grip on his empty rifle locked so tight his knuckles were bone white beneath a thick layer of grime. The sudden silence in the valley was absolute, heavier and far more oppressive than the gunfire had been. The violent auditory assault of the last hour was gone, replaced by a high, continuous whine ringing in his ears. Slowly, the ambient sounds of the desert bled back in, the dry rustle of the wind scraping against the adobe ruins, the frantic, shallow gasps of Miller breathing, and the steady drip of fluids hitting the baked earth. Caldwell forced his neck to turn. The dead fighter lay face down in the rubble, a tangle of faded green fabric and cheap canvas chest rigging. Blood pooled outward from the catastrophic head wound, moving sluggishly through the chalky dust and turning it into a dark, sticky paste. The man's right hand was still cramped in a half-curl around the pistol grip of an AK-47 that lay just inches from Caldwell's knee. The barrel of the enemy weapon was still smoking. Caldwell looked past the body, tracing the steep, V-shaped incline of the trench all the way to the top ridge. There was no movement, nothing but a thick cloud of brown dust hanging stagnant in the windless basin, and the occasional hollow clatter of a loose stone sliding down the walls of the aqueduct. He shifted his gaze back down to the shallow irrigation trough. Miller was still kneeling over Jackson, but the younger SEAL had frozen. Miller's hands were locked in a death grip on the plastic windlass of the tourniquet, high on Jackson's thigh, his knuckles shaking. Miller was staring wide-eyed at the dead man on the ground, his chest heaving, trapped in the paralyzing shock of the near miss. Caldwell reached up with a trembling hand and keyed the radio strapped to his chest. "Overwatch," Caldwell said. His voice cracked, dry as the sand around him. He swallowed hard, tasting grit and old adrenaline, and tried again. He forced the hard edge of command back into his throat. "Overwatch, this is Alpha 1, sit rep." High on the ridgeline, 350 yards away, Olivia Hayes kept her eye glued to the scope. The heavy barrel of her M110 was smoking violently, white tendrils of vapor curling off the carbon-fouled steel. The suppressor was dangerously hot, clicking and pinging with sharp metallic snaps as the metal expanded rapidly. The heat radiating from the weapon washed over her face, smelling of burnt powder and scorching nylon. Her right shoulder throbbed, a deep bruising ache radiating down to her collarbone from absorbing 25 consecutive hits of recoil. The muscles in her forearm were locked in a tight, painful cramp. The laceration on her cheekbone had torn open wider from the vibration of the rifle. A fresh drop of hot blood traced a path down her jaw, cutting through the dirt on her face, and dripped onto the stock of her weapon. She didn't wipe it away. Through the optic, she scanned the trench. The intense heat mirage rising from the canyon floor made the tangle of bodies look like a single, shifting, indistinct mass, but nothing was actively moving. 25 bodies clogged the narrow rock chute. The thick dust, kicked up by their boots, was finally beginning to settle, coating the dead in a pale, ghostly layer of desert powder. She expanded her scan, jerking the reticle away from the slaughter in the trench. She swept the rocks above the aqueduct, tracking along the high ground, looking for spotters, trailing elements or reinforcements. Empty. The enemy commander had bet everything on the rear assault, pushing his entire maneuver element into the funnel, and he had lost. Hayes let her finger slip out of the trigger guard. She exhaled slowly. a long, ragged breath that rattled in her chest. The cold, robotic detachment that had taken over her brain to execute the impossible math finally switched off. The human part flooded back in, and it hit her with the force of a physical blow. A sudden, terrifying wave of adrenaline nausea rolled through her stomach. Her hands began to shake, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that threatened to rattle the rifle against the rocks. She pulled her left hand away from the handguard and pressed her bare palm flat against the burning hot shale. She let the sharp, blistering heat of the rock ground her, using the physical pain to override the neurological crash of the adrenaline dump. "Alpha 1, this is Overwatch," Hayes replied. She focused entirely on keeping her voice flat, slow and deliberate, masking the aggressive tremor in her chest. "The trench is clear. Target area is neutralized. You are secure on the rear." Down in the compound, Caldwell let the back of his head fall against the crumbling adobe wall. He closed his eyes for 2 full seconds, letting out a breath he felt like he had been holding for an hour. The radio confirmation broke the spell holding the courtyard in stasis. Caldwell snapped his eyes open. The immediate threat of being overrun and executed was gone, but the combat reality seamlessly shifted into a medical nightmare. The clock was still ticking, and it was getting louder. "Miller!" Caldwell barked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the younger man's shock. Miller flinched, his eyes tearing away from the dead fighter to look at Caldwell. "How is he?" Caldwell demanded, sliding over the rubble on his knees until he was at Jackson's head. Miller looked down at his teammate. Jackson's skin had turned a horrifying shade of translucent grey. His lips were pale blue, and his skin was cold and clammy to the touch, despite the oppressive desert heat. His chest was still rising and falling, but the movements were jerky, shallow, and terrifyingly fast. "The bleeding stopped," Miller said, his voice raw and wet. He pointed down to the tourniquet, which had bitten deep into the muscle of Jackson's leg. "The TQ is holding, but he's deep in hypovolemic shock cap. We don't get whole blood in him in the next 10 minutes. His heart is going to quit entirely. He just doesn't have enough fluid left in the pipes." Caldwell nodded grimly. They had bought themselves a handful of minutes with Hayes's gun, but time meant nothing if they bled out in the dirt. Caldwell keyed his radio again, changing the frequency dial by touch. Command, this is Alpha 1. Caldwell transmitted, bypassing the tactical net and pushing straight to the operations center miles away. Declaring emergency exfil. Enemy flanking maneuver repelled by Overwatch. We hold the basin, but we are combat ineffective and black on ammunition. I have 1 urgent surgical, category Alpha. Gunshot wound to the femoral. We need an EVAC bird in the air 5 minutes ago. Transmitting LZ coordinates now. If we wait for a standard launch window, we will be loading a body bag. Static hissed for a torturous second before the calm, urgent voice of the radioman back at base came through. "Copy, Alpha 1. Dust-off is already spinning up. ETA is 8 mics. Pop smoke when you hear the rotors." 8 minutes. It sounded like an eternity. As Caldwell and Miller began the grueling process of dragging Jackson's heavy, dead weight out of the trench and toward the flatter section of the ruined courtyard where a helicopter could safely lower a hoist, Hayes remained motionless on the ridgeline. She didn't sit up. She didn't pack her gear. She reached down to the chest rig strapped tightly over her armor plates. She pulled the empty magazine from the well of her M110, dropping the hollow steel box into the dirt beside her hip. Her hand found a fresh, fully loaded 20-round magazine. She drove it up into the receiver until it locked with a heavy metallic click, then slapped the bolt catch paddle. The bolt slammed forward, chambering a fresh piece of brass. She adjusted her position on the hot rock, ignoring the sharp ache in her shoulder and the stinging cut on her face. and pressed her eye back into the rubber cup of her optic. Below her, through the magnified glass, Caldwell and Miller looked incredibly small. They were exhausted, battered men covered in blood and dirt, struggling under the weight of their dying brother. Hayes shifted the rifle slightly, lifting the crosshairs away from her team. She began to methodically scan the ridges, the distant tree line, and the high canyon walls. She swept the deep shadows of the desert for any sign of a secondary ambush, any glint of a sniper's scope, or the dust trail of an approaching technical. She would stay on the gun until the helicopter arrived. She would stay on the gun until Caldwell, Miller, and Jackson were lifted out of the dirt and safely into the sky. She would stay on the gun until the valley was empty and she was the only one left on the mountain. She centered the red chevron of her reticle on the distant horizon, her index finger resting lightly against the trigger guard. The shaking in her hands had completely stopped. Alpha 1, Overwatch. Hayes whispered into the mic, her voice carrying the quiet, unwavering promise of a guardian angel coated in dust and blood. I have your sky. Get him home. From the terrifying, impossible math of 25 targets in 10 seconds to the raw, adrenaline-dumping aftermath, Olivia Hayes proved why SEAL snipers are the deadliest Overwatch on the planet. But survival in the kill box isn't just about making the shot. It's about the brutal endurance to keep holding the line until your brothers make it home. If you want more intense, grounded stories of modern combat, hit that like button, share this video with your crew, and subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss an episode.